So the request to have this talk really began because of the summer school in philosophy that we tried to run, for which we had some classes. But now that you're here, yes, we will hope to speak to you about philosophy, but given that it's you, a whole host of other things as well. All right, let's get started. This is a bit of a weird question, but what has been the opportunity cost to the field of philosophy because you decided to teach and specialize in economics?
When I was very young, I think 14 years old, I thought I either wanted to be an economist or a philosopher, because those to me were two very fundamental ways of thinking about the world and finding first principles. There were lives where I could read a lot of books and write things, but at least two factors intervened and pushed me toward economics. The first is simply that economists get jobs and philosophers don't. So that's a very economic rationale. Maybe that meant I was slated to be an economist to begin with. But I thought the very fact that I have this idea, maybe a true philosopher wouldn't. It meant I should be an economist. But also my sense of what it means to make progress in philosophy. I think that's a quite difficult concept. So philosophers still study Plato quite seriously, and I think that's entirely appropriate. But still, you have to wonder, what can I add to this heap of argumentation that has been going on for millennia? In economics, progress is easier to recognize. I can see quite clearly things that economics has a grasp of today that they say didn't in 1980, 40 years ago, or more if you go back in time. And I found that more satisfying. I felt I would just learn more things. And in some ways, I've actually still worked in both areas.
Indeed. Although what I was trying to get at is, how do you think philosophy would have benefited had you been a philosopher rather than an economist?
Oh, I don't think philosophy would have benefited at all if I had been in philosophy. To whatever extent philosophical reasoning has benefited from me, which I would not presume to judge, but it's benefited from me coming at it with economic modes of reasoning and doing something different that philosophers maybe were not completely doing themselves. And blogging and podcast, I've done that with philosophers, but I've been able to do all that as an economist and with the resources of an economist. So I'm quite sure nothing has been lost. I had no brilliant hypothesis about how we all really do or do not have free will. And as Leibniz might have suggested, all things have gone for the best relative to constraints.
Okay. Given this answer, however, and given the central thesis of stubborn attachments, should more people be asking this question? What is not the opportunity cost to me for having chosen a profession, but what is the opportunity cost to the profession for I having chosen something else?
I think people in general do not think rationally about their professions. This is quite interesting because it's one of your biggest life choices, profession and marriage typically, correct? Or maybe what country to live in. And the influence of peer groups and role models seems quite large. Just having a single mentor can, nudge you in one direction rather than the other. So I think it's an interesting question. How might we improve how people choose their professions? And the best answer I've been able to come up with is that when you're young, you should expose yourself to at least one person, one admirable person in a whole bunch of different professions. An economist, an accountant, a politician, a journalist, whatever you might be thinking of. Just try to meet one person that you somewhat admire or maybe admire a great deal in all these different areas and just see what clicks with your intuition rather than letting whom you meet just be steered by drift and inertia. I think that would be my advice.
All right. You at the start of the textbook Principles of Economics, you and Alex Tabarrok have a definition of economics which goes along the lines of economics is a study of how to get the most out of life. If that were to be the definition of economics, should individuals ask other people what most means to them, or should they figure it out for themselves? And whatever the answer, is that how an economics student should be thinking about philosophy?
I think you figure out questions about your own life in dialogue with other people. So I think it's good if people ask you, what do you mean by most? I don't think you can figure it out on your own. So this Socratic sense that knowledge is fundamentally dialogical, I very much adhere to. when Alex and I wrote economics is about how to get the most out of life, we really meant it's about decisions. It's not just about money or business, but a question such as how many children should you have, or what career should you choose for reasons other than money, that's economics too. There's something about a logic of choice, how means and ends interact, thinking in terms of opportunity cost, incentives, comparative advantage. All that is economics. It's very general. We're trying to make a pitch to non-economics majors why economics is so important.
Mhm. Given what you just said, and given the question that I just asked, should an average student who's an undergraduate student today, should he not bother trying to ask it at all what most should be? Should that be a question of empirics and learning through experience as one goes along?
Well, I think one has to ask rather futile questions very frequently, because mostly what you learn is from experience or watching what happens to other people. But part of the process is you ask futile, somewhat meaningless questions, bang your head against the wall, and then keep on returning to those questions, but they have to be primed in your consciousness. So if you go around asking, what is the meaning of life? Of course, you will never answer that question in what I would describe as a meaningful fashion, but you still need to ask it and fail at answering it to learn something about it through the other mechanisms that will be at least partially effective. So I say, go ahead and ask, talk about it, bang your head against the wall. The wall is part of what focuses your attention on your real methods of experiential learning.
That's oddly depressing and liberating at the same time.
Exactly. And not to get too frustrated at your own frustration is another way to put it.
Indeed. Okay, it's going to be a bit of a long quote. You've mentioned in your ideal university that teachers would be compensated on the basis of how many students they could attract, in a manner suggested long ago by Adam Smith, who himself lived under such a system in 18th century Scotland. My question is actually related to another blog post that he wrote. How did Adam Smith and his students think about the elasticity of demand?
If you read Adam Smith, I don't think he has a clear notion of elasticity of demand. I think Malthus does. As far as I know, Malthus, early in the 19th century, was the first economic thinker to have some notion of elasticity. For Smith, you just have a lot of constant curve industries and long-run equilibria. Now, my notion of an ideal university, keep in mind, first, it's for the United States in particular, where teaching is not rewarded. And second, I don't think all schools should be like that. I don't know how all schools should be. It's just the one I want to open as an experiment. Right. And I would just like to see if you separate teaching from grading. So other people grade the students, right? So the teacher can't cheat just by passing everyone. Okay. And then you would reward teachers. How many students were attracted to their mentorship? That seems to me like something worth trying again. And we really don't do that in the US. We kind of do the opposite. If you attract a lot of students, it's a burden and you're not compensated or given much more in the way of resources. So that's my one thing I want to do. But the world in my country is not cooperating with me.
The reason I asked the question is because there was another post, and it was a horrific one to read, about how a professor offered to give people higher grades for taking payments. And the title of that was, right. And you mentioned separating of the grading of the course as opposed to teaching. And that, I think, is how you would handle this problem of the elasticity of demand in your ideal university. Would that
right now in the United States, and again, it's not the same in every country, but student evaluations of professors can be important. And the way you get good evaluations is to be somewhat easy rather than to be tough and flunk people. That to me is a bad incentive. And this one extreme case where a professor sold grades, I was shocked at how low the price was. And he price discriminated different amounts for different students. But a good grade, like to that professor, was worth $200, $250. And these would be, reasonably wealthy students. So that also says something about the system. Apart from the professor being corrupt, it means there's something more corrupt about the other parts of the system as a whole, the ones that pretend to be non-corrupt. And that is part of the lesson of that episode.
Indeed. Okay. what has Songdo taught you? One, about urbanization. This is a selfish question. But second, what has George Mason's presence in Songdo taught you for the internalization of American education?
Songdo has taught me that you can start basically a new city and it can work. And you see the same lesson from Dubai, and in fact, the same lesson from several different parts of India, Gurgaon, forgive my pronunciation,
Yep.
but it's essentially a new city and a new political unit. Works better than many other parts of India. So I think it's a lesson we are seeing repeated, and it's a very optimistic lesson. The world very badly needs new cities. Now, the George Mason University presence there, when we started having our campus branch in South Korea, in Songdo, I was skeptical, but it has kept on going. I believe financially it's doing okay. And I visited once and I met with the students. I gave a talk to them. This was in Korea, of course. And they were quite good and eager and enthusiastic. So I don't know all the details of that operation. I think it is working. And I would like for schools to try to do more of this. But to pick a country kind of riskier than South Korea, I don't know that South Korea so much needs another school at this margin. Try it, say, in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. That would be my dream. Maybe try, my ideal university there.
One can hope. On a related note, which is the model that excites you the most in American universities today? Minerva, Arizona State University, or Harvard? I suspect one of these is an irrelevant alternative. But
the model that excites me personally the most, and again, I'm not saying it's for everyone. I know it isn't, but that's Minerva. So to go back before the pandemic, the original Minerva idea was that you spend several years in other countries. So 1 year per country. It could be Argentina, it could be Turkey. There were countries that were interesting and very different, but like safe enough that you can go there. And I think that's a fantastic idea. I'm a big believer in study abroad. Our daughter, she spent a year in India, in Bangalore, learned an incredible amount, much more than if she had taken classes like in Chicago or something. So I love the Minerva model. I know a lot of families can't afford it. It's not fully general, but that's what I wish I had had. And, we'll see how it does. I'm not well informed about how Minerva has fared through the pandemic because it hurt an essential part of their model.
Right.
And I believe they've kept on going by selling off their online platform to other institutions to do other things online. I mean, that's fine. But the part of it that interests me has been shut down now for almost 2 years.
If Minerva is the model that excites you the most, and you mentioned pre-COVID, but does the lessons that we have learned as an educational community post-COVID actually make it more possible at the margin for universities to follow the same model, but only virtually? Is there merit in that?
I think in American, and indeed most universities around the world, you will see much more online education than before. Most of it will work. I think you can believe it is worse than face-to-face. But look, the worst face-to-face professors, you learn nothing. So how can it be worse than that? And it's easier and it can be cheaper. So just imagine you would take your worst quarter of professors, whoever they may be, and sub in online. It has to be better. It cannot be worse because that worst quarter, you learn nothing. So I think the world has figured this out and it is going to stick, but there will still be campuses, professors, face-to-face. All that is highly robust. No reason to dump on it. But at the margin, right, key economic concept, at the margin, we could do with less of it, and we will.
I hope this turns out to be right. But continuing the same theme, Tim Ferriss very famously rejected an MBA and chose to relocate to San Francisco and learn by investing in startups. Whether it is David Perel, whether it is Seth Godin, and many others, there are working models of how online education might work and actually do a better job. The question that I want to ask, and I'm still not sure if I'm going to be framing it correctly, will the future be more a case of universities looking like these models, or will these models end up looking more like universities? Where on the spectrum will the equilibrium eventually land upon?
I don't think we know, but my best guess is this, that we already have a great new method of online education. It's called the internet, right? Like that's there. And it doesn't give you a degree. I'm not sure we'll have a lot of formal online education that like mimics a 4-year college.
Mm-hmm.
What may happen is we just have other ways of certifying quality, like a GitHub page, or did you start a business, or who can vouch for you on Twitter. And the online university, the internet, it's there. It's huge, right? So we may be in that equilibrium already more than many people realize.
Right. What would you want to add to David Perel's liberal arts essay? Is there anything that you think you could add to what he's already said?
I did read that piece. I'm a big fan of David's, but I read so many things, it's not clear. I mean, it's clear to me many of the things he says, but what he left out, if anything, is not something I would remember. But I would just say this about liberal arts education. It's maybe most valuable for people who will have leadership roles. And if you are very ambitious as a founder, a CEO, a politician, a thought leader, those are the people who should be most interested in liberal arts education, because it helps you think conceptually and understand other people's points of view and enter other people's worlds and crack their cultural codes. So I think it's now greatly underrated. I'm all for STEM, that's great, but I think we talk too much about STEM and not enough about liberal arts.
Indeed. Okay. This is ancient history where marginal revolutions is concerned, but way back when in 2006, you had mentioned, and once again I'm quoting, there is something about having the person right in front of your face that triggers your biological pay attention alert mechanisms, and that you weren't in favor of online learning back then. I don't mean this is a gotcha question at all. My question is, what specifically were the social and technological changes that led you to change your mind?
Well, in 2006, YouTube as we know it did not exist, right? And YouTube has since arisen, and it is massively popular. It might be the single most important part of the internet. And you can't use YouTube for everything, but most things, if you want to learn them, YouTube is the best place to go. It's often better than Wikipedia. And it could be about history, it could be philosophy, it could be how to cook, it could be like how to, fix something in your house. So the success of YouTube really has swayed me. My own online education is now on YouTube. I don't think my 2006 comment was wrong. The person in front of you is more vivid and more memorable.
Yep.
But look, YouTube works. It's passed every conceivable market test. So I've updated my view.
Not wrong at all. In fact, I remember before the COVID crisis hit, you made it a point to have as many of your conversations with Tyler in person, even if it meant traveling halfway across the world. The follow-up question to what I just asked is rather, what technological changes are next when it comes to improving education, in your opinion, number one? And number two, what are the thresholds that these technologies will need to cross for you to change or update your mind again?
Well, I think Zoom and Google Meet, they're good for some things, but they don't really work with very large groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we will over time build some version, whether you call it virtual reality or the metaverse, something better that will work with larger groups. I don't think it's in the next 2 or 3 years, but I don't think it's 50 years away. Like, we'll be around to see it, or at least all of you will be. So I think that's the next step. Facebook is working on this very hard.
Yep.
But I think there's problems on the user side in terms of transmitting, coordinating. I don't think it's a simple problem. I don't think we're close.
Right.
People find it disorienting to put on a headset and be immersed in a gaming world. And a lot of people love it and a lot of people hate it. But we need something that works for almost everyone, and we don't have it yet.
I'm very much in the latter category. I don't see how learning can happen with VR goggles fixed around your face, but maybe it's an age thing. Maybe the students are much more naturally attuned and have grown up in an atmosphere where they find it much more comfortable.
But even they have not grown up with virtual reality goggles, right? Maybe their children will, but it's not natural still to most people. And to me, it feels very claustrophobic.
Couldn't agree more. This is a question that is very close to my heart, and I'm very curious to hear your answer. Deirdre McCloskey has a very famous essay in which he says it is all but impossible to get an undergrad student to do economics, as opposed to learning the principles, actually applying those principles in life. And the claim is it's all but impossible to make this happen. Would you agree or disagree, and why?
Well, I think I disagree. I would like to read all of her words, but we all live economics every day. Our demand curves slope down, right? If the price of something goes up, you buy less of it. So people, in a way, have a pretty phenomenal grasp of economics to begin with. There wouldn't be economics if people didn't largely follow its principles. Can you get students to improve their economic behavior? I think absolutely. Just teach them about compound returns. I'm not saying everyone masters that lesson, but it really does influence a lot of people. And I think she's far too pessimistic.
All right. Okay. Our field remains unsure, and when I say our field, I mean economics, unsure of what principles of differentiation rule how culture and economics will be related in a particular problem. You mentioned how this is perhaps the hardest question in social sciences. Given this, how should this line of thinking influence how principles of economics ought to be taught specifically to undergraduates?
Well, for teaching principles of economics, I think the single most important thing is the enthusiasm of the instructor. The instructor cannot be emotionally and morally asleep or dead, right? So if that element is there, like the student feels this man, this woman loves economics, is passionate about it, I feel most of the rest will work. Like you can't teach the wrong content, right? But what's really scarce is the passionate side. And the rest will work itself out, and students can, go to YouTube if they need to, other places. They can use the textbook, and they will iterate. So exactly how you explain things in class, I don't think is, in a way, that important a question.
I didn't mean how one explains stuff, but how should one change the syllabus to reflect the fact that students should learn as much about culture as they do about the principles of economics?
I don't know. I think it's just in what you tell them when you're lecturing. I'm not sure it's a syllabus question. So if you're an instructor, let's say you've traveled a lot and you have good and interesting and vivid stories about where you've been and why it reflects economic ideas, that will be fine. I don't think you have to touch the syllabus. It's really about the human being. And like, is that person delivering on giving a damn and being alive and out there in the world and going to other countries? So I think we need to reform the people, not the syllabus.
Okay. You had a blog post about a month ago in which you spoke about what should be taught more in a first year graduate sequence, and you mentioned emphasized very strongly on price discrimination. What about the flip side of that question? What should be taught less in a first year grad program?
Well, in economics, we have something called mathematical theory that is highly refined. It's very elegant. I don't think it's so relevant for the real world, but I think we teach too much mathematical theory, too much general equilibrium theory. I would teach them more about how government works also. And price discrimination you encounter every day, especially, online. So that's mentioned in a typical first year sequence, but I would give that more attention.
All right. I can't remember where I read this, and I tried searching for this online, but I couldn't find it. But I think the story goes something like this. It was Alex Tabarrok who suggested that the two of you start a blog, and you responded by saying that let's write a textbook first. Now,
it's backwards. He came to me and he said, let's write a textbook. And I said, let's start a blog first, and then we'll do a textbook. And that's what we did. So I was right, I think.
Okay, so that was going to be my follow-up question, although I got the order wrong. Why would you recommend this, starting a blog before writing a textbook?
Well, we were much better known after we started the blog. So if you start a textbook and you're not that well known, your textbook will die. And most textbooks don't get past a first edition. The key is to get to a second or third edition, because most times it's an experiment and then the publisher drops you, they lose interest. But I felt if we had a blog, that was worth doing for other reasons. But also we would have this big platform of readers who would consider using our text. And indeed, that's how it's worked. So I think we had exactly the right sequencing there. And Alex recognized it, once I said it, to his credit. So He was not really ever in opposition to me.
Okay. What are the strongest arguments that make Twitter on balance a positive force for learning, even today?
The return on what?
Twitter. What are the strong arguments for Twitter as a learning tool?
What as a learning tool?
Twitter.
Oh, Twitter. Twitter drives a lot of people crazy, and it makes many people stupider and more upset and even depressed.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that it's a general learning tool in a good way. But if you avoid all politics, and if you are detached and kind of steel yourself and don't get involved in the bad, negative side of Twitter, for figuring out quickly what's going on in the world, I think it's like the single best place to go. I wouldn't give it a general recommendation, but used properly, it's pretty phenomenal. I think Twitter search is often better than Google search. Hardly anyone uses it. I'm not sure why. But you've really got to avoid the politics, or you will become stupider yourself, no matter what your point of view.
All right.
The thing is, Twitter helps you see how stupid the people are you disagree with when they're stupid. So the worst things they say get circulated. So you're always seeing the people you disagree with. Oh, they're so bad. They're so stupid. They're immoral. And you start thinking you're so right. But, maybe you're not. You might be partly stupid, immoral, whatever. Twitter's not good for that. It reinforces your biases too much.
All right. You spoke about how it turned out to not be an argument between you and Alex Tabarrok. One argument that you actually did have, and I'm very curious to hear about how your answer has changed about this. Are vouchers a bad idea for American education even today, number one? And whatever your answer, does this successfully translate across other countries as well?
First, I think other countries are quite different. It's going to depend on the country. Private education in India, I know, is quite a different story than in US. It's probably more important in India. My view on vouchers is this. I favor them. I've always favored them. I favor the element of choice involved. But I don't see when they have been tried that they have improved American education very much. Maybe by a slight amount. But when you look at all the evidence, to me, it is underwhelming how little they've mattered. And I once asked Milton Friedman this. I said, Milton, what about all this evidence? And he just brushed me off. I think he didn't have a good answer. So to me, this is a puzzle. I don't see why the competitive aspect hasn't mattered more. The problem may be just in a lot of cities, there aren't enough schools in a given age class for you to create that much competition. So again, I'm for vouchers, but like 25 years ago, I just thought they would be great. Now I think they're good because it's pro-choice, pro-liberty. It's what a lot of parents want. But the gains I've been disappointed by.
Okay. This is also a very old post from Marginal Revolution, all the way back from 2005. And the line, once again, I quote, "We are programmed to remember interpersonal exchanges better than written or spoken drones." You've written this in context of you requiring your PhD students to read blogs and then take an exam on those blogs. One, it was in a sense your own David Bowie moment, so congratulations. But second, the question, at the undergrad level, I'm often tempted, say, for example, to put up the conversation that you had with Danny Roderick if I'm teaching development, or a conversation between Thaler and Farmer if I'm teaching behavioral finance. And I think that conversation does a better job than anything I can ever do in class. At the margin, for all teachers the world over, should we try to rebalance more of just showing podcasts and then discussing them, or showing conversation, discussing them, or still emphasize in-class teaching? What is the right?
I agree very much with what you're saying. So the old orthodox view is students can only learn one thing. You've got to teach them one truth. You've got to tell them, here's how it is. I get why some people think that. But look, in a world with the internet, no one is really going to believe you, right? No one thinks you hold the truth. And when people see debates, arguments, it becomes real and vivid. It's actually like the lives they live, because they argue with their family all the time about whatever, may not even be economics. They understand argument, I can assure you. So that, I think, brings it to life. and they start thinking better for themselves when there's a kind of clash in front of them. So I definitely think we should do more of that.
Okay.
This is not 1955 anymore, where the professor can like say one thing and the student has nowhere else to go. Correct?
Indeed.
Not how the world is today.
Although, now that you brought up 1955, Irvin Collier has a lovely blog called, I think, Economics on the Rearview Mirror or Rearview Window. I can't quite remember. He digs up old question papers from universities, especially in America, but usually the world over. Would you agree that the quality of the questions has gone down over time?
I'm a big fan of Irwin Collier. I think he's doing great, extremely important work. I would say the kinds of questions have changed. So in the 1950s, even 60s, exams would ask you questions to see, like, do you understand an economy?
Mm-hmm.
And that's still closer to my own approach. But they wouldn't ask you that many questions like, do you understand models, or do you understand particular literatures? And you actually need to know both. And today the exams are all like very specific questions, solve a problem, know some specialized method. And we're creating students who know specialized methods and don't understand very much at all about how an economy works, or they can't think about a simple basic economic question. So we've gone too far away from the earlier exams. But look, the earlier system was itself highly imperfect.
Yeah.
You had a lot of people back then, like, who couldn't make any empirical judgments really, couldn't do empirical work. So we need the best of both, but we've gone too far in the current direction.
Okay. You yourself had a question, I think I learned about this from Chris Blackman's blog, where you just walked into class one day and said, design the most difficult question you can, answer it, and you'll be graded on both.
Yes, I've done that a bunch of times. Now everyone knows about it. So I don't do it as much because people are ready for it. But it just seems if you've learned the material, look, when you're out in the real world, it's not like taking a test. You have to be ready for anything.
Mm-hmm.
And what matters is how well do you know the stuff you know best? And that's what this kind of exam was getting at. It's just like, hey, show me you know something, please. And it worked pretty well.
All right. It's a broad question. Feel free to take this in any direction that you want to. Is a culture that values honorifics less likely to be a culture of excellence?
I think you need the right balance of honorifics and excellence. So if you look at Silicon Valley, very little use of titles. People just know, like, did you start a company? How well did it do? If you're an angel investor, how much money have you made? And that works really well. I think at the margin, our world should be more like that, just like performance-based metrics, not too many titles. But another part of our economy is more bureaucratized. We may not want it to be that way, but for now it is. And there's particular titles. I'm not sure there's any simple way of doing away with those. People care about titles. They're themselves a little petty and status conscious. And we need to shape some of our honorifics to both reflect that and also control it a bit. Think of honorifics as limiting envy or limiting like Girardian mimetic desire and just stabilizing things a bit. You know, like you're a police constable, like you have some kind of title. You're the person with the weapon, right? So you can't forget that. And people looking at you, there's no simple other way for them to measure your performance. So you have a uniform and you have a title and like a stick or something.
It's a bit of a selfish question. I honestly don't know how to resolve this dilemma for myself. I ask all my students to call me Ashish, but I can't get myself to call you Tyler, for example. It always has to be Professor Cowen. That's a function of the culture that I grew up in. And I'm very aware of the hypocrisy when I ask students to call me Ashish, but still refuse to call anybody else by anything other than Professor. How should people of my age think about this and solve this?
I find the cross-sectional variation very interesting. So like I was a professor very young, like I was 25, and I looked very young. And I still then said, everyone call me Tyler. The people who couldn't do it were the older students who were like 40, because they felt they needed to show that although I was like a kid, that they still respected my role as professor, and they couldn't do it. They like literally couldn't do it. And then a bunch of people from non-Western countries also found this harder. If people can't do it, I mean, I don't think they should force it, right? They're just going to get stressed. But at the end of the day, I think it's better if people can do it. So like before this chat is over, try once calling me Tyler. Like, let's see if we can make this happen. And if we can't, that's okay.
All right, I'll try it. No promises though. How does one get better at asking stupid questions while traveling? This is with reference to, once again, a very early post, but I found it to be great advice and I've used it whenever I have traveled. But more importantly, as you travel more, how do you retain the ability to continue to ask stupid questions?
That post, I remember that I wrote it. I don't remember what I said, but my current answer would be just to do it through practice. Don't be afraid to look bad. Like, no one cares, really. They're typically flattered if you show interest. Like, don't be insulting to them. Have a very friendly tone and smile and be open. Don't act arrogantly. But just try asking. And people might not even answer your question. It might be too stupid. But they'll say something else, and that will be interesting. So just let them guide you, in a sense, where the conversation goes. They will improve the quality of your stupid questions with their answers. Now, is that what I said way back when?
Yes, you did. And this was in reference to Megan McArdle's series of articles about traveling through Vietnam and other parts of Asia in 2006. So yes, your answer has remained more or less the same.
So I'm consistent over time, somewhat.
Indeed. Okay, the last thing I wanted to do was play underrated or overrated with you. But I have a different game that I play with my daughter. And if you're ready for it, I'll explain the game. And if you're willing, we could play it.
I'm always ready.
All right. So this, I and my daughter, we call this game Choices. I give you two options. You must choose one. And I must guess which one you will choose. And then you must explain whatever your choice is. What is the reasoning behind it?
And you guess before I tell you my choice,
yes,
obviously.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. Okay. So the first is Pakistan or Bangladesh, the more exciting growth story from South Asia. I think you'll still choose to go with Pakistan.
As a more exciting growth story, I have to go with Bangladesh. In per capita income, it's surpassing or on the verge of surpassing all the other countries. They've had real reforms. I loved my visit to Pakistan, but the country is still a mess. And yeah, I'm sorry, but Bangladesh it will be.
All right. Okay. How much did your trip actually help change your mind about this to Pakistan?
I thought Pakistan would be worse than it was. So the trip made me more optimistic. One thing that made me very pessimistic is how often people in Pakistan talk about India and complain about India. They all felt it was their life's mission to tell me all sorts of things about Indian politics, whether you agree with them or not. My attitude was like, look, your country has its own problems. Worry about those first. You know, don't worry so much about India. That to me was the most pessimistic thing. But I think what was optimistic was the level of talent, the level of English proficiency, much higher in Pakistan than in India, actually. And then Islamabad is one of the loveliest cities in Asia. And I know it's artificial and it's small, but simply that it was possible to pull that off at all, I took to be a pretty optimistic sign.
All right. Given pretty much any situation in any context, Alex Tabarrok's intuition or a really good econometric model? And you can't give the Paul Samuelson answer.
Okay, I have my choice.
Okay, I think you will choose Alex Tabarrok's intuition.
Absolutely. I go with Alex all the way. Triple down, whatever we need to do. Not a close call.
And has this been re-emphasized because of COVID, or was the intuition, I mean, would your answer have been the same regardless?
It would have been the same regardless. So I'm not at all surprised that Alex was basically right about everything during COVID. In the George Mason lunch tradition, like for many years, sort of Alex is the one who has the correct intuition about what is simply right. And we all would defer to him on that. So this way precedes COVID.
How do we learn to, at the margin, be more like Alex Tabarrok?
Well, the single best thing you can do is to actually meet Alex, if you can, to make Alex vivid. But barring that, read him, every day, watch him on YouTube. videos on Marginal Revolution University, the text he wrote with me. There's a lot of ways of consuming Alex Tabarrok. A lot of ways.
All right. A food trip to a part of India you have not been to yet, Odisha maybe, or a food trip to a part of China you have not been to yet. Which would you choose?
You said the food.
Yes.
Okay. I have my choice.
Given diminishing marginal utility, I think you'll choose India.
I definitely would choose India, and for a few reasons. First, I've heard the food in Orissa and Bihar is just phenomenal. And Kerala, I've never been to those three parts. That's criminal. I feel terrible. And India, to me, probably has the best food in the world, and it varies more by region. Now, if I go to China, Chinese food varies a lot by region, but actually less than Indian food does. And furthermore, I've been to more parts of China. I've been to what I think are all the best food parts, like Sichuan and Hunan, and the Southwest near Kunming, Yunnan. So my marginal part of China is not actually that interesting for food. Whereas Kerala, Orissa, Bihar, like, my goodness, those are food universes unto themselves. I think. Of course, I haven't been. But I will go once pandemic lets me.
Indeed. On a related note, who in your opinion is India's answer to Fuchsia Dunlop?
Oh, I mean, the cookbook by Julia Sani, I quite like, and I've learned a lot from, but I don't think there's an actual rival to Fuchsia that I know of. And that may reflect that India has more diversity to offer. Like, no one can really master it in the way that Fuchsia has mastered at least 3 or 4 different Chinese cuisines. So it's tribute to Fuchsia, but also tribute to India.
All right. For any major city in the world, you get to visit it, but you must give up one of the following: either the food from that city or museum visits while in that city.
I have my choice.
I think you'll choose to give up the food.
No, I think it's the museums. But again, it depends on the margin I'm at. So if I'm in Europe, the food in a marginal European city is not that interesting to me because I've already eaten like everywhere in Europe. And I do mean everywhere. So I can give up the food. But most of the places I haven't been to are not in Europe. They would be like in Kerala, or they would be in Africa. And in those parts of the world, the museums are often not that significant, or they're not in great shape, but the food is incredible. So I'm going to give up the museum and go with the food. Keep the food.
Okay, I haven't been keeping tab, but I think I've scored less than 50%. I clearly need to read Marginal Revolutions with more attention. But the final question from this game: overrated versus underrated, or choices? Which was more fun to play?
Well, for me, choices. Oh, I said that too quickly because I do overrated, underrated all the time. So at the margin, I want the marginal revolution of choices. But you knew that already, right?
Yep, pretty much. All right. If you had to recommend places to travel to within India specifically for Indian undergrad students, which is your audience right now, which places would you recommend and why?
Well, I have been to India 5 times, which is not a lot, but it's actually more than most people, right?
Yep.
So I can tell you what impressed me the most. The Classical Music Festival, Indian classical music in Chennai, is like, for me, the best thing in India, just personally. And I think it's a phenomenal part of Indian history, culture, learning. It also helps you think better. So I would recommend to all human beings that they do that. I also thought Chennai had maybe my favorite food of anywhere in India. I couldn't say best, but I just loved that. Now, most people don't think of Chennai as such an attractive city, and it's not India's most beautiful city, right?
Yep.
But because of music and food, for me, it was an A+. Now, as a general city, I mean, you've all been to Mumbai, but I think it's like very high quality for seafood. You just have a bit of everything. Many of India's most interesting buildings, lower levels of air pollution. I love the Gate of India, the breeze on the water, different walks. So Mumbai for me is like very high on the list as a great place to go. I have strongly conflicting feelings about Delhi. I love the feel of the sophistication, the power, the intellect, but traffic pollution, I don't know. I'm not like dying to go back to Delhi, and I've been twice. I'm very glad I went. Uh, I would love to see Calcutta again. I've only been once. I think for bookshops, kind of intellectual spark, just feeling different, like its own universe unto itself. It could be its own country. Food, the best sweet shops in India. To me, that's like a must to go there. I don't love the Taj Mahal. I think it's worth seeing, but it's like not actually a peak experience for me in India. I much more prefer just Rajasthan in general, which I think has manageable size cities, the charm of like old India still intact. You see like elephants and fantastic textiles and pink buildings, and the side of India that is magical as we imagined it in earlier times, to me, is most alive in Rajasthan in a bunch of different parts. And again, it's just manageable to travel in. You're not somewhere like Delhi. That would be like in my top 3 for India, would be to go to Rajasthan. So like Rajasthan, Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, I guess would be my high points. I really liked Goa, but I would put it actually below those. I think it's sort of like going to Hawaii in America. Like it's gorgeous, it's great, but it's a little off the central track of Indian history and culture, which is fine. But if you like went to Goa, I almost would feel you haven't been to India yet. So that would be like my rough overview of where to go in India. But I've never been to Kashmir. You know, that's more difficult now. It's a tricky thing. Yeah. I would like to be able to get there. I'm sure it's quite spectacular. And I haven't been to Kerala, which is like a favorite of many, many people. And I just like mid-sized cities, a place like Pondicherry. Just very charming, very manageable. You can hang out there, super relaxing. To get to a bunch of sort of mid-tier places like that, I would recommend, and not just the biggest cities.
All right. Calculus, statistics, programming, Shakespeare, and the Bible were your picks when you, this was when you were recommending to Yana what she should focus on learning when she was 14 years old. The audience that we are speaking in front of isn't much older than that. Would your answers remain the same or would they be different? We localize the Bible. But that
tell me the list again.
Calculus, statistics, programming, Shakespeare, and the Bible.
I would stick with that. You know, if you're not living in a Christian or Jewish country, you might switch out the Bible, you know, and put in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, depending where you live, or the Quran. But even then, you should study the Bible because Christianity is a major religion. So yes, I absolutely would stick with that list.
Wonderful. Okay. One last question from me before we get to questions from the students. Your next book is about recruiting better, if I'm...
Finding talent, yes. How to find talent.
What advice would you give for students to play the other side of that game, as it were? So if they go out in the job market, what should they be thinking of at the margin?
It really depends on your situation. So the book has a whole section like how this question is different for men and different for women. And it's really very different. I suspect that is also true for India. But I think you want to demonstrate competent execution for most jobs. And you're not yet worried about proving you are a leader. You just want to seem completely on the ball and well prepared and eager and enthusiastic and responsive, that you actually listen to the questions. And to show you're a good listener by being a good listener, I think is good advice in many circumstances.
All right, great. Professor Cowen, thank you so much. We have questions from the students. They'll either put them up in the chat window, I'll read them out, or I have some that they've already sent in.
My pleasure, and thank you for being so well prepared and for doing this. You remember many things on Marginal Revolution better than I do.
Thank you so much. All right, so questions for the students. This is from a student who's currently in TY-BSc. Would you prefer a version of the book of Disquiet, which I should be clear, I have not read, in which the thoughts were lexically ordered? It would obviously render the Disquiet part almost wrongly placed, but wouldn't then he be able to communicate more thoroughly?
That's a very good question. For those of you who don't know the context here, the Book of Disquiet is by a Portuguese author, Pessoa, but it wasn't written as a book. It was just notes he kept throughout his lifetime. And after he died, they were organized in the form of a book. So no one really knows what is the correct order of these thoughts. I would like to see someone create an electronic version of that book where you can arbitrarily reorder the thoughts, maybe according to different principles or even just randomly, and then read a different version of the book multiple times. I think that would be worth doing for fans of Pessoa. I'm one of them. So right now we're so locked into the printed, published version of the book that's come down to us. And it's interesting, the Argentinian author Cortázar, he wrote a book called Hopscotch, and he gave 2 separate orderings for the chapters for the reader. You can read either one, and you get a very different book. So he did that on purpose. I think we should do that with more books, but especially this one.
Okay. Can what we know of economics be taught to aliens? That is there a role for human values in economic thinking?
I've never met any aliens. I suspect their demand curves slope downwards, right? If they didn't, they would run out of resources because the price would go up and they would keep on spending more. So I strongly suspect we can teach them economics. But that said, there's a whole other part about economics that's about how do you understand the situation? So price isn't just money. It's like status or how other people interpret what you're doing. So that whole interpretive dimension for aliens, I think, would be probably completely different. And in that sense, we'd have a very hard time understanding their economic behavior, even though their money demand curves still would slope downwards.
I'm tempted to relate this to Star Trek and so many posts that you've written about Spock and Captain Kirk. Would that be a good way to think and learn more about this?
That's a good place to start. But keep in mind, Spock is half human, and even his other half Vulcan. You know, due to panspermia, they're not that different from humans in the broader scheme of things. So to understand Spock, who's like a nerdy guy, it's not that hard. He's not that different. It's when you see the episodes with these other aliens that are like pulsating fields of plasma or something. That's when the real economic challenge comes. And then you've just got to throw up your hands.
All right. Had your mentor not been Thomas Schelling, how would your attitude towards decision-making have changed?
I don't know. Thomas Schelling gave me a model for what a career could be, and he also helped me get my first job, which was extremely important in my development. So I think my career would be different and much worse if not for Thomas Schelling. But look, I had read everything Schelling ever wrote then and have reread a lot of it. So I'm not sure like my actual views would be so different.
Mm-hmm. All right. Gandhar asks, and Gandhar, I suspect you might have to explain what the contentions were. This is a book that I recommend heavily to everybody in practically every class I teach. Joe Studwell's How Asia Works. And Gandhar,
yes, it's one of my favorite books on economic development.
Indeed. Noah Smith apparently wrote what were the weak arguments in How Asia Works. I'm sorry, I can't recollect them right now. Gandhar, if you do, would you mind explaining them?
The weak arguments in that book?
In How Asia Works, yes.
I don't think he has a sophisticated enough take on land reform. So he writes as if land reform is just flat out a good thing. To me, that is debatable. You've had a lot of countries do land reform and not end up in the East Asian prosperity position. And I tend to wonder, you know, if those countries had not done their land reforms, might they have done well anyway? Hong Kong did very well. Singapore did very well without the land reforms of, say, South Korea and Taiwan. So I think he's leaping too quickly at that conclusion. Mm-hmm. And I think he needs more comparative work on Hong Kong versus the other nations on industrial policy. So all those countries, except Hong Kong, did industrial policy. It all seemed to work, but Hong Kong didn't. And again, Hong Kong became as wealthy as the others. So maybe industrial policy is more a symptom than a cause. I don't know, but I think he's too quick to draw inferences from 4 or 5 data points.
Okay. This is a question I was tempted to ask once I heard your podcast with Neil Ferguson. Do you agree with Neil Ferguson's evaluation of the British colonial empire? I remember you pushed back a little in that conversation itself.
I think Ferguson is too optimistic about the role of the British in India. So he thinks it was very positive. I would say it depends on what the counterfactual is. If the British had not ruled India, but just traded with it and let India evolve on its own, I think India would have been better off. Even the bad socialist policies post-independence brought higher growth rates than India enjoyed under the British. So the British were concerned about defense of India, conquering India, taking the tribute. They had a relatively small number of bureaucrats in India. They did almost nothing to develop human capital. The railroad and, the irrigation system, that was great. But I think a lot of the gains from that went to Indian landlords and not Indian common individuals. And the British just way underspent on public goods in India. And they also prevented a coherent Indian government from emerging. Now, how long that would have taken without British rule, I don't think anyone can judge. Certainly I can't judge it. But when I look at growth rates, my intuition is to think British colonialism really did not do such a good job with India. Now, if the alternative is that the French take you over, I say bring on the British, right? So again, it depends on the counterfactual. But I think Ferguson, he's too pro-British. He's a Brit. Right. What do you expect? Exactly. And he's a Scot. And the Scots were like the leaders of British imperialism. And he's still playing that emotional role.
Indeed. Although I can't help but think about how better or worse a cuisine would have been had the French influenced Indian cooking. Vietnam did fairly well.
No, the cuisine turned out perfect. Like, the good thing about the British is their food then was so bad, they didn't ruin Indian food. So you could take some things from it, but keep them separate from your good stuff. I think for Indian food, British rule is the best you could have done because their food was bad. It's interesting. You look at Goa, of course, which was Portuguese, right. And Goan food is very influenced by Portuguese food. So the role of vinegar is not so common in India. The role of pork is not so common in India. The way certain things are fried. And I'm very glad one part of India has the food of Goa. I love food in Goa. But at the same time, I don't wish, the Portuguese had taken over all of India. Again, in that sense, the British were just fine.
All right, we have time for one last question. Divyanshu asks, if you have no capital constraints, what are the first 5 problems you would solve and why? And if 5 is too much, restrict yourself to 1, 2, 3, whatever you prefer.
Well, I think for most problems, the real constraint is talent, not capital. If I had access to more talent, I could raise more money to do things. So the key questions I want to see solved, and it's what I'm writing on in my next book, is how can we do a better job finding and cultivating talent? And for that problem itself, I lack the talent to make more progress, not the capital. But that to me is the big question, and especially important for India, because we know there's so much talent, from the recent blossoming of Indian achievement, which was really not the same 30 years ago, but it's the same Indian people with more opportunity. There have been all these chances, but there are still so many people in India who are super talented, but they're not found or not able to achieve the opportunity, or there are barriers or issues because they're women, or there are caste issues. And solving problems of talent, that's my big thing for the moment and probably for the rest of my life.
Wonderful. Professor Cowen, I'll try. Tyler, thank you so much.
Oh, awesome. We did it. We managed. How did it feel?
Not too bad, actually. I could get used to this.
Great. Thank you all for listening. I saw a question pop up, Sartre versus Camus. I much prefer Camus. I don't think it's close. And Sartre was a bad communist. He treated women poorly. I don't love his writings. Camus to me is a great thinker. So I would say Camus. But thank you all for listening, and let me know when this is up on YouTube. I will blog and tweet it.
I will. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.